Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted I'd love to say I could see you. Delighted to have you this evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the staff of the National Museum of Bermuda. Thank you so much for joining us for this event, our fourth event in our Tracing Our Roots Routes program. I'd like to say thank you to the generous funding support from our community of donors, individuals, foundations, and corporations, and our membership, perhaps yourself. We were able to present this program as a result free and accessible to all. My name is Lisa Howie. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement at the museum and the moderator for this event. Thank you to the entire National Museum of Bermuda team who are behind the scenes working really hard to ensure that we have engaging programs, that the museum grounds look fabulous, and maintaining the collections and helping to sustain the future of the museum. For those of you who've been enjoying our series and enjoy the museum just generally and value our work, we would love to have you join us as a member. So consider becoming a member today or renewing your membership, and you can donate through our website, nmb.bm. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and once editing is complete, it will live on our National Museum website, and it will be underneath the umbrella of the rest of the remaining programs, or the programs we have already recorded, which is under the Tracing Our Roots header. We welcome your critical feedback. So please be sure to complete our very, very brief 2-question survey at the end of the presentation. And we'd like to encourage your participation. So please be sure to use the chat. The chat button is right there, sort of in the center of the bottom screen. Use the chat to speak with us, to ask your questions, and to participate and share your voice in this event. So Tracing Our Roots Routes really gets into the key question of where does your story begin and what legacy does it unfold? As a series, the program emerges from a growing community interest in genealogy. And our goal is to give you the strategies and resources to help you to document your family history. And we hope that it will help you to make new connections with your past. Our overall goal to assist and encourage you is so that you can explore, honor, and preserve your family history. The Tracing Our Roots Routes program has included 2 workshops on the journey of family discovery, each accompanied by a very resourceful toolkit. Then in April, we met with a team of professionals from the Smithsonian Institute to explore personal journeys and personal objects. So we were specifically looking at the development of the collection for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. All of these events, as I mentioned, are recorded. They live on the museum website. And the resources are there meant for you to use, to share, whether you are a teacher, whether you are family. And I'm hoping actually that the work that we've done this past year might be something the families can tap into for their summers when planning activities together. Upcoming, we will have in July, we'll be featuring an on-site contemporary art exhibit by local artist Jerde Hassel, in which she'll be exploring the theme of our program in the capacity of the visual arts. And later in the year, we will culminate the program with a crowdsourced exhibit called Bermuda's Family Scrapbook, which will be displayed both online and on the walls of the museum. So please stay tuned for more. We hope that through the program, you will have the tools now to research your family history and go as far as you can go or wish to go. You know, as a person who's embraced this myself, you do end up sort of riding waves of interest or ability and focus, because sometimes it's quite overwhelming and it takes a little while to get back in. And other times you've actually found yourself digressing completely from your initial question. And you might find yourself somewhere else and you need to find your way back. So we hope that we've enabled you to at least embrace and embark on that journey. We also hope that the journey has involved the opportunity to speak with and listen to the stories of others for guidance and inspiration. One of the pieces of feedback that I have heard is that this program has inspired people to have interviews with some of the elders in their family. And I hope that if that's something that you wish to do or know that you should do, I hope that you do find time for that sooner than later. We also hope that through the program that you have some creative strategies for communicating your findings and your story. And that segues directly with where we are today and our presentation, Crafting a Personal Story with Dr. Janet Ferguson. In this session, We will illustrate how personal stories and memories are anchored in everyday personal objects. We will show how to create a polished written piece that documents these memories. And then, using StoryCenter's material memory storytelling approach, Dr. Ferguson will explore the associations we make with a cherished family photograph or object, and how by exploring these associations, we can reveal further memories or sustain relationships, and perhaps even provide new ideas and personal growth. Dr. Janet Ferguson, known by most of us in our community, she is the former executive director of the Lifelong Learning Center at Bermuda College. She is a storywork facilitator and a member of the board of StoryCenter. Dr. Ferguson is a National Museum of Bermuda trustee, and she chairs the education committee. StoryCenter is an American based international nonprofit dedicated to creating spaces for transforming lives and communities through the acts of listening to and sharing stories. They developed the digital storytelling workshop in the 90s, and since then, they've partnered with organizations like the National Museum around the world, training thousands of people on how to share their stories. And just this past week, we concluded a teacher professional development workshop in which two colleagues from the museum worked with five other teachers from our community to develop their digital stories. It was quite an experience. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Ferguson. And I look forward to your presentation. And I really look forward to this being participatory with the audience. So please, again, be sure to keep your chat open. If you click the bubble chat, the chat space will become available to you. And please be sure to participate with us through this next busy, fun hour. Thank you.
Okay. Lisa, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and good evening to everyone. And thank you for joining us. I think Lisa has done a wonderful job of framing and placing what we're doing in context. And what we hope to do is to review some examples of stories about objects, and then we will actually explore the value of those stories. And we'll also develop a deeper understanding of how those stories about objects are put together. How are they made? How are they written? And the idea is that you will be inspired to, perhaps at the end of this hour, create and write your own stories about valuable objects or valuable family objects. So let's look at how the agenda allows that to flow. We've sort of done the welcome and review. And in fact, we're in the middle of the review. The overview, I'm going to talk just for a minute or two about why stories about objects are significant, why are they important. And then we're going to ask you to become participative, and we're going to ask you to introduce your object or your item by just telling us what it is in the chat box. And we'll tell you when. We'll give you a signal, we'll tell you when. We're also going to ask Lisa and Debbie Atwood, both members of the NMB staff, to participate by sharing information out loud about their items so that we have some kind of interaction. Once we've sort of all got into that space, as it were, that space where we're thinking about holding, touching, in touch with our object or our item, we will look at a story that's an example of an object story, and it's called Grandpa's Spoon. Before we look at the story, we are going to suggest to you what you might want to be looking for so that we can have a really rich discussion after we've looked at the story. Once we've looked at the story, we will talk about how the story is shaped. We'll talk about how we put these stories together. And then we will look at another story, the prayer book. And we'll have another bit of discussion around what you saw, how did it land on you, how is the story shaped, and what's the value of these kinds of stories. And then we'll look at the final story, which is the Red Star. Again, we'll do the same thing, we'll explore the story, we'll raise the value or the significance of personal stories emerging from objects. And then finally, we'll have a bit of chat room reflection and we will close out. So before we move to our first story, let's move to having a look at the overview. We have an overview during which I'm going to share with you why stories about art. Really quick. I don't know, does anyone recognize the washboard or the scrub board or the washing board, whatever name you give to it? This is actually a picture taken from my mother-in-law's book, Mrs. Elizabeth Cayley, and it's a picture of a scrubbing board. This was an item that would have been in every Bermudian household, at least, let's say, 80 or 90 years ago. And I am quite sure that every family that we can speak to would have a story about this item. Did it appear on Saturdays? Was it used every day of the week? What kinds of soap did you use? Who did the washing? What time of day? And then what were some of the stories that people remember about incidents, issues, critical things that happened? And so this is a demonstration of the way in which memory is often anchored in objects and in place. And once we have that object, that item, we can speak to it, whatever the item may be. It could be your grandfather's pocket watch, your aunt's sewing kit, a pair of carefully preserved binoculars. But for each of those items, there's always a story. And these stories are the containers of our cultural practices, of our relationships, of our significant events that are always grounded in material objects. So they're important at a personal level, they're important for families, and they're important as community narratives. And they're often tied to objects, and I think the museum, the NMP, we know museums internationally are taking an interest in this story because these stories are the stories that anchor popular memory. When we bring these ordinary, these everyday stories, we bring popular memory to the forefront. So these items are always storied, they're always narrated, and they're repositories of our knowing. Through these stories, we gain deeper insights into ourselves, into our communities, into our past, and into the legacies that we want to pass on to the next generation. And the best stories are always personal. Yes, we've got the grand stories of history, the great sweep of history, the big things that happen, but it's the small things around ordinary objects that are really important. And that's why we ask you to bring your ordinary objects into the room. And we hope you have them with you because we are going to ask you on the next slide, which is introduce your objects. We are going to ask you to write the name of your object into the chat box. So what's the name of your object? And write one thing about your object or item. That's what we're asking you to put in the chat box. There's another question there, but we don't know if people want to share that in the chat box. We'll move to that question after I've spoken to Lisa and to Deborah. But before I go to them, I'm going to say I bought my object. Here's an example of an object. It's my grandmother's, it's the last piece from my grandmother's favorite set. And I also bought another example of an object, and it's a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. And at the end of this workshop, I will share a story about this object with you. So that's two examples of objects. And now I'm going to ask Lisa and Deborah to share their objects with us. Tell us a bit about their objects.
Well, I chose a teacup as well, actually. And this was given to me by my head of department when I was teaching at the Barclay Institute ages ago. Um, and he wanted me to calm down. He wanted me to recognize that teaching a school year is a marathon, not a sprint. And I thought that the extended metaphor of the teacup to the gesture of actually having one's tea is to slow down and
Ooh.
yes, have an opportunity for reflection, Dr. Ferguson. I think that might have been Mr. Weber's intention. Hmm.
I love it. It's a marathon, not a
Not a
sprint.
sprint.
Have a cup of tea. I can hear a story. I can hear a story. I think I can. Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Debbie, your item, please.
Yeah, so my item is it's a small cedar moongate that my parents took with them. They were married in the UK, and my dad wanted something in Bermuda. So he found this small cedar moongate and they took it with them, and it was had pride of place. It was originally meant to be on, I think, a wedding topper, like the wedding cake topper. But I think my mom saw it and said it's going to look like a handle for the cake. So it was moved to the side of the cake for the presentation of the wedding cake. But we still have it to this day, and it's very much symbolic of their wedding day. So yeah.
I think I hear another story, Debbie.
Yep, definitely.
Definitely, you can get a story. Wow. And I'm seeing examples coming up in the chat box. Somebody's got a spinning wheel, someone's got a teacup, someone says grandma's wooden chair, the family Bible, a small tricycle bank, a wooden toy box, great grandmother's wedding ring. Thank you. How beautiful. Father's childhood boom, a book. Ah, a straightening comb belonging to my mom, a Bible, a huge, heavy New Testament with notes, an old-fashioned hot sandwich maker, a 5-generation photo, a stamp book collection. Every one of these items, we can build personal stories. And so that's what's, thank you, wow, and the items are coming. A stamp book collection, silver candlesticks. Thank you, folks. Oh, this is wonderful. Okay, so can we maybe look, before we look at a story, can I ask very briefly one more favor? People who have those items and people who are thinking of items, could you write a note to yourself? You don't have to put this in the chat if you don't want to, but it's just a note that says, if you were to introduce this item, the person, a thing, an item, just in a very short phrase, what would you say? What would you say? If you were to introduce this item, I think we heard Debbie introduce her. I think we heard Lisa introduce her. If you were in a shortened form to introduce your item, what would you say? I'm looking at these items in the chat. I desperately want to see the wooden high chair that's nearly 85 years old. Desperately want to see that. The 5-generation photo book. Okay, that is putting us in the right frame and in the right space to look at our story. Thank you, guys. You're really carrying us along here. Now, we are going to look at a story, and at the end of it, I'm going to ask, how did this story land on you? What stood out? And I'm going to ask you at the end of the story to put your answer in the chat box. The name of the story is Grandpa's Spoon, and it's an example of a story about an object. And as I said, you have your object, you've written in the chat box, you've made a personal note, you've taken us into the terrain. Now let's look at this story, and I'm going to ask you at the end of it, how did this story land on you? What stood out? And then we will deconstruct it. But let's sit back, relax, and look at the story. Thank you.
When I was 6, the first letters I learned were the ones on my grandfather's spoon, U and S. He used that spoon at every family lunch. We could only look at it after Grandma washed the dishes. My grandfather told me that back in the 1940s he was a prisoner of war. American soldiers took everything from him. The only thing that he could keep was the spoon they gave him. He wore it on a string around his neck. Once, he used the spoon to dig himself into a rail wagon full of coal to escape captivity. He was caught and brought back to the prison camp, where he stayed for another 2 years. When he was finally released at the age of 18, he weighed only 38 kilograms. But he was alive and he kept that spoon. Still, his life was not easy. His mother left him and his brother at an orphanage. She could not feed them. Like so many people at the end of the war in Hungary, they had nothing, no chance for education or work. Fortunately, a teacher saw something in my grandfather, and the socialist state paid for his studies. So, my grandfather was grateful for the system. They educated him, he got a job as a mining engineer, and his inventions were used in several socialist countries. The leaders of the party expected him to join their hunts, and sometimes he let me come along. We hiked and quietly watched the elks. He took only a gun and no bullets. When people in the party laughed at him for returning without game once again, he just smiled and never said a word. My grandfather died in 1989. My grandmother gave me his spoon. To this day, I remember him while I'm using it to eat soup. I wonder sometimes what he would think about our new era.
Yes, thank you, Debbie. Thank you for queuing that up for us. I'm going to give everyone a moment to absorb and to write in the chat perhaps how did that story land on you? What stood out? How did it land on you? What stood out? And any other thoughts that come up about the story. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask Debbie and Lisa to pull their ideas together and give us some feedback to the same question so we can have a bit of a discussion.
Sure.
Thanks.
Shall I go?
Yes, if you're ready.
Well, I think what's interesting about the spoon, I was thinking about the word us, actually, and that this object, this very small object, which is essentially seemingly quite inconsequential, actually carries with it this meta narrative that, yes, it is about this grandfather and his arduous journey, but I feel that it is also a reflection on, in terms of the meta narrative, our appreciation for freedom, the tenacity of spirit that our forebears have had. And so the function of this, the functionality of the spoon, to be useful, and yet it's also so heavy with some symbolism and empowerment.
Yeah, I definitely heard or felt a lot of the similar things, Lisa. I think for me, what stood out was when I saw the spoon initially, there's a couple things going on. Like, first and foremost, when I think of a spoon, I think of food. And then you hear the stories about starvation and malnutrition and even hunting, where he wasn't even bringing food back. And so those kind of double plays on what you think a spoon is used for. And the fact that his grandson is using it now is great. Like, it's still in use as a food utensil, even though it wasn't necessarily just a food utensil when his grandfather was imprisoned. It was, an escape item. It was so much more than just a spoon. And I think the other thing that kind of struck me was, oftentimes you get spoons given as kind of christening gifts sometimes to kids. So the thought that this is still a family heirloom, but it's not your stereotypical kind of christening gift of the silver spoon, right? But it is a silver spoon of memory. Like, it's full of meaning. It's full of nuanced stories beyond just the functional element of an object. Yeah, no, I absolutely love the story. I thought it was very, very powerful.
Wow. Wow. Okay, thanks. So I heard in similar things in both your comments around the significance of the spoon. And Lisa, you talked about the appreciation of freedom and the functional spoon crying its way out, during the prison. And at the same time, what it's meant over time, the multi-generational significance of the spoon. And I think you emphasize that quite a bit. And the fact that it's still in use, and it contrasts so sharply with just, not just, but the way we symbolically think of spoons being handed on as christening spoons or items that are of significance merely by their presence. This is significant through its use. And wow, the comments in the chat. Something as small as a spoon can have such strong memories. Yes, I agree with you, absolutely. And that's the point of object stories. Thank you. The eerie link to the image of the modern day stood out the most for me. Yes, it's wonderful the way he brings it all the way forward and doesn't answer the question at the end. He says, I wonder what my grandfather would have made of what's happening now in the world or the way the world is now. The strong connection between generations, how an object can present a person and a relationship. Absolutely agree. That's the role and that's the work of what we call material stories or stories about objects. There's another one I see here. The power of preservation and the connection that it makes. Yes, and it makes this connection when we actually tell the stories. And one way of telling the stories is writing them down. We don't have to get all the way to a digital story, i.e. a mini movie. It could simply be a story that we write down. Wow, they're coming in. The eerie link to the image of the modern day stood out. Something as small as a spoon. Significance was not in the size, but in its symbolism. The spoon connects the family historically and futuristically, and that's what object memory stories do. It links the past to the present and beyond, because it's the legacy for future generations. Now, I'm going to pause for just 1 minute to explain perhaps how this actually works. So we are going to take a close look at Grandpa's spoon. That's what we good. Thanks, Debbie. That's really helpful. And I'm not going to read through all that because we can send that to you. That is the script of the entire story, with me putting highlights as to how it actually works. And I am going to give you the really, really condensed version of what is on the screen. First, he connects. He says, when I was 6, the first letters I learned were the ones on my grandfather's spoon, U and S. He gets our attention. And that's the first thing you do when you're writing a material object story. You get the listener the reader's attention. The second thing he does is he gives us context. And the context is about his grandfather's experience as a prisoner of war, trying to escape. And then he goes on to say at the end of the war, what his grandfather does, how he was trained, how he works, and all that is context. And he gives us just enough context or background information so that we can make sense of the significance of the spoon. This is obviously a shortened history of his grandfather's life, but he needs to give us just enough. So we put the spoon in context. And remember, these stories are usually limited to 300 words. It's a discipline. And then there's that beautiful place in the story when he talks about his grandfather going hunting because the party said you must go hunting, and he only took the gun, he says, no bullets. And that to me is the gem. It reveals something about the grandfather's character, about his personality. We can imply, we can speculate that maybe because of his experience as a prisoner of war, maybe his experiences of the war, maybe all those things brought him to a place where he would go hunting with a gun with no bullets. And the writer doesn't elaborate. He doesn't preach at us. He doesn't say, my grandfather was a great anti-vax. No, he just gives us just that insight. He took only the gun, no bullets. And he wasn't upset when people sort of made fun of him or thought he was odd. That was fine. And that is where that's what we call the change point in the story. And by change, we mean the insight. What's the bit in the story, or where are the lines in the story that take us to insight? This is what the story is teaching. This is the reveal. This is the interior texture of the story. And then he takes us to closure. He says, to this day, I remember him while I use it to eat soup. And then he says, I wonder what he would think about our new era. And someone in the chat picked that up really well and commented on it. And there I've tried to give you a sense of how these stories are put together. There's the connect. How are you going to get the attention? Like the rhyme of the ancient mariner, he stoppeth one of three outside the door to tell his story. How are you going to get the attention? Then how are you going to set the context? How much information do you need to give so that the story makes sense to the listener or to the reader or to the person who's viewing? And then what is the change? What is the insight? What is that nugget inside the story? He took only the gun, no bullet. And then how do you close the story appropriately? How do you end the story? And we do that in around 300 words. It's in no more than 300 words. And that's how we create a story. Wow, somebody's put in the chat, the spoon allowed the grandson to keep his grandfather close and to be comforted. And so that's the invitation we make to you with your object, to create stories that will allow future generations to keep you close and to be comforted, or to keep people who've gone before, older generations close and to be comforted, or by the message, or by the underlying insight that you share. Okay, I think we can move on to look at another story. And this one is slightly different. This one is called The Prayer Book. And it's much slower. It's much gentler. We're going to ask you to pay attention. It's from a different cultural context. And it's a personal story that invites you to kind of look at a family across generations and to make sense of their history across generations. I don't want to talk the story out. I only want you to be aware of the pace and the tone and the requirement for reflective engagement. So this story is going to slow us down, and we're going to ask the same questions of Lisa and Deborah, and then we're going to ask the same questions of you. What stood out? What did you notice? How did it land on you? And we're going to ask you to put your thoughts in the chat. And we're queuing up that story so that you can look at it like now.
The scroll is precious to me. It's about 1.5 feet long, made of hard paper and wrapped with an orange cloth. The script is yellowish gray, handwritten mostly in Tibetan, with a few mantras in Sanskrit. It's a Buddhist prayer book considered very sacred. I don't know who wrote it or how exactly it came into my family. All I know is that it was my grandmother's. She passed it on to my father. He's not so much into religious things, but he saved it to keep a memory of her. And then, eventually, he gave it to me. My grandmother was called Nima, or the one with the radiance of the sun. She told us a lot of folk tales and talked about the family and all the generations. She also shared stories about being in prison after the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1959. That was a hard time for our country. She finally left 20 years later. My grandmother took her last breath with her head resting on my lap. So, like my father, I keep the scroll because it reminds me of her and the family legacy. My mom was a nurse in India and Nepal before she got married to my father. Then I was born and named Ngawang, which means powerful speech. Our family is scattered around the world, but I really believe in the scroll's words. They say so much about how to live your life with strength, fortitude, compassion. I am a caregiver too, and the words balance me in difficult times. It's also a symbol of my mom, Amala, which means pure. She was the one who always took care of it. When I was a girl, I used to watch her carefully open it up and flip the pages to remove the dust and make sure the papers would not get stuck together. I imagined the hands that had done this before her and who they belonged to. At first, my parents were worried about whether I could keep the scroll safe. I promised I would give it to my children so they know where they are from. I've had it for 10 years now. It has traveled a lot. I keep it right on the top shelf, and every morning when I do a prayer, I put my head down and bow to it.
Wow. I'm just going to allow a moment to let that sit with you. Before I ask, what stood out? What did you notice? How did it land on you? And I'm going to ask Debbie and Lisa the same question and maybe elaborate a bit on whether they saw connection and context and change and closure. But for people on the chat, if you can say what stood out for you, what did you notice? How did that story land? You could pick up the connection, the context, the change, the closure, right after the discussion with Debbie and Lisa. So I'm going to ask them those preliminary questions. What stood out to you, Lisa?
No, you know what I thought it was really interesting with this one is that as an animation,
Mm-hmm,
we are imagining the scroll,
mm-hmm,
and I think what's something to be said about the writing, and as you pointed out, the limitation on the words, is
mm-hmm,
therefore every choice of word is very potent.
mm-hmm,
And what I really enjoyed was in her hook was
mm-hmm,
in my imagination as this beautiful, delicate scroll. And of
mm-hmm,
course, that is leading to another memory that I have with something
mm-hmm,
else that was also a scroll.
mm-hmm.
So I really enjoyed almost like the not seeing the actual
Yeah,
object in order to be able to imagine how absolutely delicate it is. And
yeah,
just the thought of actually, we all know in the museum field how delicate paper is,
yeah.
and that for it to be cared for and cultivated and preserved across these generations is in itself
Mm-hmm,
very interesting for me.
yeah.
Um, I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll let Deb before I go on. If I could go on, so I'll pause.
But
Um,
you're raising some wonderful points. I really like what you're saying, particularly about the scroll, the careful choice of words, and the provocation of memory, your own memory by the story. That's invaluable. Yes.
And
Sorry
and
to
I'll
cut
just
you off, Debbie.
no. And one other thing was that, particularly in our current context, when we get an opportunity, I think more than we have in a long time, or maybe ever, is to really be thinking about what's important.
Ah,
And I've always said the only object you need to carry out of your house if your house is on fire is your passport. But
yeah,
I can see why she'd want her scroll.
nice one.
It's such a charged object that wouldn't perhaps have any value for anybody else. It's certainly not going to
Yeah,
get her through as an immigrant, a refugee. It's not going to get her access anywhere. But its meaning making is so profound. Okay, I'll be
wow.
quiet now.
I know that's insightful, and I really like where you're going with it. I do, I do, I do. Debbie, do you have anything to add?
yeah, so I think what stood out for me was and Lisa hit on it, was the preservation element. So, I mean, obviously, as a museum professional,
Mhm,
preservation of materials and objects comes to the fore. But I think with this one, there was this tie-in between not only the very careful preservation of the object itself.
mhm,
I mean, they were so careful, and when they did pass it on to her and saying, we're not sure if you're ready to take care of this, but it's not just the object itself, but it's the present preservation of the memories embedded in that object, and
yeah,
the knowledge that not only are you going to care for and be a steward of the object itself, but you're also caring for and being a steward of the memories attached to those objects. So,
yeah.
we talk about this in the field. Objects have biographies. They
Mhm,
collect biographies, and they collect
mhm,
stories as each
mhm,
person interacts with them. And it's clear in her story that she takes on the role of the preservation element very seriously, not only in her care of the object itself, but also in sharing those stories and those links between those different generations with others. So yeah, I found that quite powerful, linking.
Mhm. Well, Debbie, do you mind if I kind of fly or off that thought or attach to that thought that it's possible to ask the question of ourselves, in what way are we all curators? In what way are we all responsible for preservation? In what way are we all stewards of the objects that are passed on to us? And sort of obligated to pass them on with their stories. Interestingly, I did some work with someone around story who had their house completely destroyed by fire. And they were actually recreating, much like this piece, pictures and stories about the significant objects that they lost, because it was a way of rebuilding and reconnecting with life. So we're going to have, before we go to the next one, we're going to look at another story, again, that's different. It takes us back to Eastern Europe. And this one is a personal story that invites us to look away from the big picture of history and to focus more on the small events, the personal stories, and the interior of those personal stories.
The first Christmas tree I remember is the one we got when I was 7 years old. My mom bought a big red star covered with glitter to place at the top. The tree had no lights on it, so it wouldn't attract attention from the street. My mom decorated it on her knees. She told me it's too risky to put on the star. But when tears filled my eyes, she pulled the curtains to cover the window, stood up, and attached it to the topmost branch. She became my hero. It was 1989. The dictator Ceausescu had run away. I didn't quite understand what a dictator was or where he went. I suffered because it was clear that next year I wouldn't receive the uniform of a pioneer. I would remain forever a poor hawk of the country, wearing the orange shirt of a child. I cried with all my heart. I wasn't allowed to go outside or stand up near the windows. The sound of bullets hitting rooftops nearby made my body jerk involuntarily. My parents said terrorists had come from the foothills where I played in the summer. I imagined ninja fighters like the ones from the illegal kung fu video cassettes my dad used to bring home. On Christmas night, I slept in the living room with my parents. We watched TV obsessively, on the couch usually reserved for guests. Somewhere deep inside, I wished the revolution would never end, so the three of us could snuggle there forever. But at midnight, my mom shook me awake. The trial was starting. Through sleepy eyes, I saw the death of people I considered immortal, as the light from the image reflected on the ornaments brought our Christmas tree to life. The revolution passed, my parents got divorced, and I never became a pioneer. But I became a free person, and wherever I am, every Christmas, my red star takes its place on top of the tree.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. Thanks for clearing up that story. So that's our final story, actually. And I asked the same questions of everyone. How did that story land on you? What stood out? How did the story connect with you? What was the larger context? Where did you see change? And how did it close out? So maybe, I don't know if you want to comment, Lisa?
It's actually, I think that's a very complex story.
Mm-hmm.
That story, differently than the others, there are a lot of informational gaps. And I actually want to go and do research on that context to better
Mm-hmm.
understand the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I was thinking about the irony, the unexpectedness of that when she said that I wanted the revolution to go on so that
Mm-hmm.
they could be nestled together on the couch.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of someone having said to me about Bermuda that they had wished that segregation hadn't ended because family unity in Bermuda was stronger then. And it's
Mm-hmm.
such a strange kind of comment to make about any space and time in which there's been such imminent violence in one
Mm-hmm.
society,
Mm-hmm.
surrounding and outside of the doors, to the point that you can't actually enjoy your tree fully with the
Mm-hmm.
natural light. You have to close the
Mm-hmm.
curtains. And yet, in her memory of it, it was potentially the most beautiful time of their family's sense of togetherness as being most
Mm-hmm.
whole. Um, a very complex story.
Yeah, I think similarly for me, I think that was one of the stories where the historical context, it was very much an everyday object that represented um, a lived experience of a historical event.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to the spoon and others as well, but I think that one really went into the details of like, no, this is what it felt like when the trial was going on. This is what it felt like when the revolution was happening. And as you said, she didn't want the revolution to end because she wanted that special time with her family. And it sounds from her story that after the revolution she was free, but her family separated and probably wasn't the same. And yet she keeps that Christmas tree and still use Christmas tree ornament and still I think has it. So it's, I mean, all the stories are very complex, I think, and exemplify very different ways to tell the story. um yeah, I think the historical context is what I took away from that, and the
Mm-hmm.
lived experience of that moment, something you probably wouldn't get in a history book, right? Like you'd get
Right.
the dates, you get the
Yep.
times, you get
Yep.
who
Yep.
was on trial,
Yeah.
what their end result was. You wouldn't get our Christmas tree was lit up by the reflection of the trial from the TV onto the
Yeah.
ornaments. Like that
Yep.
that I definitely kind of I saw it in my head. I definitely saw that. So yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, and thanks everyone for the comments in the chat. Lisa, I think you raise an interesting point, wanting to know more about the political and the public narrative, which is a response that someone from Eastern Europe had last week when they looked at it, and she immediately told us all about the context. And people on the call sort of said, well, we don't know if you really want all that information. We are really engaged by, as someone has said in the chat, the child holds on to the love and protection of the safe arms of her parents during the revolution. By keeping the star, it kept her close to remembering her family. And I think Debbie's making the point there about the personal story. And we do have the meta story, as you said, Lisa, which is the big story, the history, the one that's in the books. But nestled inside of those, like a set of Russian dolls, we have the personal story. How do these things land on people, land on families, land on communities? And that's where object stories come in. They don't, yes, they should reflect some historical accuracy, but they're not history books, and they're not meant to be history books. They're meant to be personal narratives of this is how this cut across my experience. This is how we experience this. And this is the interior of our story. And this is the meaning. So thanks to you both for kind of highlighting that kind of tension between the public historical narrative and the personal. This is what was happening in our house at that time. And these are some of the things. My parents separated. I didn't become a pioneer, but this is how it fell on me as a person. And to me, part of the role of any public institution, a museum, any, is to hold all of these narratives so that we have that beautiful diversity of stories, the big overarching historical, political, public narrative, and nestling inside of those stories that fall out of objects that tell personal stories that only people can tell because they're grounded in experience. And I think we're 2 minutes to the hour, and I'm going to go over to Lisa to ask her to close us out. But before I go, I hope people have a better sense of how these stories connect, grab attention, how they move us into the context, how they express the change, and finally, how they move to closure. We would like in the chat room, if you write, what did you notice, what stood out for you, and what do you want to work on now? One of the things we'd love to carry forward perhaps is a story circle, where you come together with us and perhaps write a story about that object that you've cited in the chat box, or you mentioned in the chat box, or any item you want to write about. We're also going to circulate some material so you can have examples of memory stories that don't have pictures and audio and video. They're simply a story written about them. At this point, I'm going to say thank you so much for engaging. The chat has been rich and fruitful. And I'm going to hand over to Lisa to take us out, wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Janet. I wish you'd been my teacher when I was growing up. I hope that this has inspired everybody. I also really hope, that just thinking about one's experience at the museum, to go up to the museum, we are open every day, and to perhaps have a rethink on the ways in which even the narratives are told about the objects at the museum. And I think that might be an inspiring kind of visit. But before I do further plugging for the museum, one of the things that's really important to us is to get feedback. For us to know that we are doing the right thing, doing a good job, meeting the expectations of our audience and our community members, it's important that we get some feedback. So there is in the chat a link to a very short survey. I believe I have asked 2 questions, and I'm just asking a little bit of background information about who you are and where you're at. So if you can please just take a moment to click on that link that is there, and then have that set aside to go back to once we conclude. The Tracing Our Roots program, as I said, it continues. We have another a very important event opening up next month, as I mentioned at the beginning, with local artist Jerde Hassel, bringing her genealogy to a contemporary visual art installation. And down the road, your participation in the National Museum's curator, Dr. Deborah Atwood's vision for an exhibition in which everyone in the community has an opportunity to participate, sharing a visual impression of an object and a short narrative to go with it. So without further ado, I know we're just over the hour, and we do try our best to stay within our time, and we respect your time. So thank you so much for joining us. And please be sure to share this experience with your family and friends. It will be on the nmb.bm website very soon. And we hope that all the resources that are there and that will be shared with you that are useful for you as you continue to embrace and embark on further your family journey.